was it about living in a communist country that bothered you and bothered other people too?
A lot of people complain. People in Czech Republic and Slovakia are masters of complaining. And a big segment of population living under the thumb of the Communist Party complain a lot about material things. I mentioned before the lines for toilet paper, salt, meat, potatoes, bananas, oranges. And somewhere at the beginning of 60s, for whatever reason, Czechoslovakian government let people from Austria and Germany to visit. I suspect it was a pretty good revenue stream. And also more and more people had TV, and those close enough to Austrian borders and West Germany borders were able to watch German and Austrian channels. So people start complaining about how good life the Western European have, and were envious about the seeming abundance of material things. You know, you saw somewhere in the 60s, I forgot what year, the first Mustang came out. And then you compare that Mustang to little ugly car we had, and we had to wait for, first it was hard to save the money for it, and second, even when you had money, you had to wait 2-3 years before you really got it. So I think that was a big thing for a lot of people, this material wanting and missing on things.
What do you think was the worst part of it, though?
So as I said, that the biggest problem is that there was plenty of big problems, but the system itself created hatred in people, resentment, and the worst was fear. Okay, so people stopped sharing their opinion with anyone they didn't know, and with their very often with their families and friends, because we all knew that there are spies among us, that someone is always making notes what we said or how we behave, and the system was able to create this paranoia, I would say, like a social paranoia, that you were looking over your shoulder all the time. And some of it stayed with me for the rest of my life. We are joking. I still, if someone asks me what's my name, I don't want to answer, okay? Which is stupid, but because on my own I tell you almost everything about myself. But as soon as you start asking questions, I get this like a little curtain and say, oh, why do they want to know it? So Radek is, I think, a typical intellectual from Czechoslovakia, okay, that generation. He was very young during the World War II. Then he lived through 1948 when the communists took over. He finished his school around 1950, 52, somewhere around that. He was a young party member. Because he was a party member, he got a lot of power. He was teaching at the university, and I have a feeling, I'm pretty sure, I just don't have any details because I didn't want to know. He participated in purging some of the old timers who were deemed to be infected by the bourgeois ideology. And then as he was getting older, he was seeing more and more what the party is doing. His unlucky thing was also that he was interested in modern art more than the classical art. In those days, when you were a social scientist, as the history of art, history of theater, and literature, those we call social science. If you did the old classical arts, classical literature, you were more or less safe, okay? If you were writing an article and you mentioned Lenin and Gottwald 2 or 3 times in the preface, then you could write whatever you wanted to about Rembrandt and Michelangelo and all this. But the modern art was a problem because modern art was something alive, and most of it was alive in Western Europe. And because, of course, the communist hierarchy, the bosses, they didn't understand modern art, they didn't understand modern literature, modern music, nothing. They a priori hated it because if they didn't understand it, it meant that it has to be bourgeois. So that, thanks to his interest in modern art, was drifting away from the orthodoxy of the party. And that happened to the whole generation, his whole generation of university professors, musicians, artists, writers. It happened to Vashek's dad. And that's why, you look back at this generation and you are not so sure that, you understand them, what they went through, but because many of them never really look back and said, what we did wasn't right, or we should do it different. That generation has a lot of baggage on their shoulders. Well, that generation is gone for now. Dad would be 92. Shabata's dad would be like 94 or so. So, yeah, that generation is gone. But they have a very mixed history, and not all of it is nice. But I think that more than half of them, around 1968, when the so-called Prague Spring started, did realize and did blush what they were part of as youngsters.
I've talked to your father before about that period of time, and I actually have sat with him while he cried, mainly about the fact that his books were taken off the shelf, and he didn't exist anymore, and that young people could use his ideas and they didn't have to give him credit. So what happened to Radek?
Okay, well, as I said, the 1968 was like a wake-up call for many of these people, and they started to be even more active. They thought that, okay, even the communists are in charge, they will let us to be creative and do stuff. And it looked like that for the whole 1968, even after Russians came in August. But then the old communist guard was getting their grip on the power again. And of course, I mean, they started to retaliate. And ideology was used as a reason for it, but very often it was just that unskilled and untalented were able to take revenge of skilled and talented. That happens in many dictatorships. So Dad, in 1969, they took his Communist Party paper away from him. That was first. Then a couple of months after that, he lost his teaching job at the university. And by 71, they took all his books out of libraries. And that was really, you're right, he cried about that. That was the hardest thing. Because for Radek, the work, the writings, was the most important thing. It was more important to him than family, more important than his ladies. Writing and talking about it was extremely important to him. So, yeah, it was depressing for him. He was able to hide for about almost a year, 9 months or so, in some healthcare facility because he, as a kid, had tuberculosis of bones, and his bones were fragile anyway, so he was disabled for 9-10 months. And the truth is, he was a poor soul with his bones, arthritis, and diminishing, density, bone density, and all that. But because it was Radek and the communism after 70s, after they took the membership was cut off from many members, and there were people had to go back to little manual works or little clerical jobs. Radek became some kind of a clerical assistant to some cultural guy who liked him, and because Radek wrote for him all the papers he had to, he was really nice to Radek. Radek didn't have a hard work. It wasn't well paid, and but he had free time to come and go. The boss was really nice to him, and was able to protect him because he was fairly high on the communist ladder. So Radek started doing all kind of underground art projects with Slovak artists and because they were not political, they were just a modern art, but it wasn't political. The police knew about it, they probably monitor it, but because it wasn't against the state or anything, they let it go. So that gave him some satisfaction, and he was able to write 1 or 2 books in underground, and they did some little. But yeah, they did because he lost his job and his ability to publish in the best his best years, the most productive years.
Okay, I know we're going on, but I need for our children to understand. And one of the big things about living in a communist country was that they never had enough housing. And so people were always looking for housing. They had to share.
Yeah.
I think you need to just explain this so that they get the picture of why in the world you would want to leave Czechoslovakia.
Well, the weather was crappy, okay? So I can tell you that here in California we have much better weather. So that would be reason enough. But like with everything else that people wanted or needed, pork for schnitzel and beef for goulash, there were not enough houses. Nobody really knew why not, because there was plenty of people in the industry who knew how to build houses. Stages, maybe they didn't have enough money, they didn't care, whatever. So to get a apartment with 1, 2, 3-bedroom apartment was almost impossible. There were long, you had to, first, that was a funny situation. It was like sometimes like catch-22. You could sign up for all houses, or 90% of housing was owned by the state, okay? From the state, it was owned or managed by the city, and each city had like city parts, or what would you call it? So like Prague has even today 10 Pragues. You have Prague 1, Prague 2, Prague 3, and so on. So the same in Brno and Bratislava. So if you wanted to ask for a flat in Bratislava, you had to have already in your ID a stamp that you are living in Bratislava. But how did you live in Bratislava if you didn't have a flat in Bratislava? So you had to first work with this bureaucratic question. I am asking for a flat in Bratislava because I live in Bratislava, but I don't have where to live. Of course, the line for the housing was always much longer than the ability or availability of houses. So what happened? Of course, people start looking for someone they know, or someone who knows someone who knows someone, and sometimes big amounts of money were exchanging hands to be able to get the housing. For example, our dad, again, right? When he divorced second time from Kira's mom, he left whatever, I don't know where they lived, but they lived somewhere. And he left on his own, and he rented just a room in some apartment. And even he lived like that for like 7 years. And when I came to him in 1964, probably, something like that, 63, 64, he was still renting a little room in one of those socialist apartment buildings you see sometimes, and he was renting that room from a lady who was a cleaning lady at the university. So, cleaning lady from the university was renting a room to professor from that university. And we both were trying to be quiet and scared that the cleaning lady and her husband, who was a heavy beer drinker, and their 2 kids will dislike us and kick us out. So when I came to him, it took him for over a year. He got a studio somehow from the university. Someone there was in charge of this department, and someone was bribed. So we lived 5 miles out of the center of Bratislava in this new development called Krasňany, in a studio. But it was fun. And you know, young people, they got married and they lived with their parents. It was absolutely normal. Situation in villages was much better because first, especially like Moravian villagers, they were becoming slowly but surely, I wouldn't say rich, but in comparison with city folks, rich, because many of them were having little plots where they were making wine and then they were selling it to the city people. They were making fresh vegetables they were selling to city people. So villagers were doing okay. And so it was easier to get a piece of land in villages and build your new house. And you know, they used to build houses that the whole family was helping on it, and took 2, 3, sometimes 10 years to finish the house. But in the city, then they started somewhere in 60s. It was a shmeh, but there would be co-ops building the housing units, and then the co-op would own the building and all the owners. So, and that was expensive for them. So to become a member of the co-op, you had to know someone. Then they took you to a co-op, and even when you became a member of the co-op, they didn't guarantee you that you will get your apartment you sign up for in certain time, but you already had to put some money down. And then when finally after 4, 5, 6 years you got your flat, you had to pay the rest of it. So most of those beautiful suburbs of Prague, Brno, Bratislava, those panel building, those were 2/3 of them were co-ops. So people paid for it, they could sell it, but it was always a struggle, especially for younger people, to get their own housing. So those idiots who are saying how cheap the apartment rents used to be during the communism, they are completely right. It was very cheap, okay? Electricity was cheap, gas was cheap. The problem was to get that apartment. So I saw 3-generation livings together. Grandma, parents, and children, and then suddenly one of the children got pregnant, so you had 4 generations. The system taught people to lie, to take shortcuts, to bribe people. And the system taught people that if you do it right and work on it, by bribery and lying, you can get even an apartment. And it destroyed the whole nation. And to this day, you can feel it, and the new generation is only slightly better because they are learning the shit from their parents.